What EU should do in the Mediterranean is such a vast question. The first issue, of course, is to remember that you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your neighbors. Your neighbors are with you forever. What you need to do is to begin to understand your neighbors, understand their anxieties, their insecurities, but also the advantages, what they bring to a neighborhood party, how you can interact with them and how you can learn from them. So the first thing would be for the EU to begin to appreciate that this is a shared neighborhood and that it needs to understand the multiple crises which are affecting the southern Mediterranean region. Once it understands that it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional, as it already knows, it then begins to think about how to respond to these multiple crises. And the minute it starts to prioritize that it needs to take action, it then has to choose very carefully about which battles it wants to fight. And the best generals will tell you, always choose the battles that you're going to win first. So ultimately, what the EU needs to do is identify the issues which are not just unilateral, but multilaterally regarded as important, and push for those to be addressed and be seen to be pushing for those to be addressed. So the question of Arab-Israeli conflict remains large. Question of Palestinian statehood is obviously of importance to the southern Mediterranean. EU has been silent on this for too long, even though in the Venice Declaration, this is going back decades, Europe has made it a priority that there should be a two-state solution to this problem. It cannot forego this. The others are issues to do with economic security, economic safety, that these countries need to feel that there is support for their economies, and that sometimes EU feels that it can dictate the distribution of resources, but other times it's important that not so much the states, but actually social groups become involved in deciding what is prioritized and how you address this. There are some universal issues, some things like the environment. The Mediterranean is a most precious waterway. Millions of us holiday there from the European Union, and yet it is under so much pressure by us as tourists, but also by abuse of this waterway. EU needs to prioritize the cleaning up of the Mediterranean, to make sure that this concern about plastic use is taken away, and to make sure that fishing is regulated, to make sure that water flows from urban centers, which are growing every day right across the southern Mediterranean, are managed properly. And if the southern Mediterranean countries need support for this, then EU should give it to them. EU needs to look at this growing complexity of Eastern Mediterranean energy zone and the way that the Palestinians, the Israelis, the Cypriots, the Lebanese, and also Turks have to manage this resource. It is in EU's interest to make sure that this is shared by the parties themselves, and that in fact it is exploited properly and not in a maverick fashion. EU is an honest broker with all of these parties, with Egypt, with Israel, with Gaza, with the Palestinians, with Lebanon. It can play a very active, constructive role in trying to make sure that this important resource, which is going to benefit Europe, of course, is exploited properly and to all the parties' advantage. Going beyond that, obviously the threat of radicalism is something that the EU needs to address, it needs to deal with, and it is not an easy one. It cannot do it by itself. It needs a multilateral approach to this. It needs to work with the local partners to deal with this, and also begin to think about radicalization as something which is not just reducible to violence. It's much, much broader, bigger picture, and it needs to begin to absorb the complexities of radicalization. And the flip side of that, of course, is to understand, to recognize how authoritarianism corrupts societies and how it is the flip side of radicalization, that actually there is a link between the state's use of its coercive power and the response that comes equally violent from groups in these societies. It needs to understand this, it needs to respond to this, and it needs to prioritize the freedom agenda. Let's not call it democracy, let's call it the freedom agenda that is central to the initial Arab uprisings. And it goes on now. Look at Algeria. It's not that the Algerians don't want to have a president, they want a president who's going to represent them, and not an octogenarian who has been president practically for life. People in Khartoum march on the streets because they don't want a good leader. Is because that the current leader has been there for too long, that is no longer responsive to the demands. EU has seen all this already with the Arab Spring. It needs to recognize that by repressing them, as these regimes are doing, you're not dealing with the problem. You're postponing the problem, and that will return even more harshly the next time round. Remember, the last crisis that Algeria faced was over postponing cheating over an election in the late 1980s. And Algeria paid a decade-long price for that problem. EU was silent because they did not want to see Islamists in power. We would never know what would have been the case if Islamists had come to power as part of a coalition in 1989, 1990 in Algeria. So learn from mistakes of the past, and instead of prevaricating, maybe be a bit more bold and take initiatives forward. And maybe with that, you'll bring some of the other key actors, United States, even Russia, with you to deal with these issues, because ultimately it also affects their interests in this region as well. And whether we like it or not, Russia is a Mediterranean power, and it is a securitizer of the Mediterranean, and it's the only power we know which is systematically using its military force in a domestic problem, namely Syria, right? We need to recognize that and appreciate what the Russians are up to, but also diffuse this and try and bring the Russians towards a position where you deal with these issues through dialogue and peaceful negotiations rather than resorting to violence as a solution to this. So there is much that Europe is sitting back and watching on its doorstep. While we're worried about Ukrainian usurpation of Ukrainian territory, the other side of it is that Russia is also close to Turkey, a so-called candidate state, a member of NATO, and the future of Syria, which is so important to Europe's own security, is being determined by a non-Mediterranean country, Iran, and by Russia and Turkey. Where is the European voice in this? So these are the issues that I think that Europe needs to focus on, to think about the hard security issues, to think about the soft security issues, but also to think more broadly about human security. What does human security mean in this particular environment? And then once you ask that question, you're dealing with a wide range of issues, from birth control to fertility, to women's rights, to environment, to political organization, to institutional enhancement, to elections, and the list can then go on and on and on. But you put human security at the very heart of your agenda.